My lords, ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered here today to introduce two esteemed guests. Our primary speaker today will be Professor Efraim Sicher of the Ben-Gurion Department of Foreign Literatures and Languages here at Ben-Gurion University. Foreign Literatures and Linguistics, sorry. He recently published the book that he'll be discussing in today's session, The Jew's Daughter, The Cultural History of Conversion Narrative, and he has published widely on modern Jewish culture and the representation of the city in the 19th century novel. His forthcoming book is Postmodern Love, Essays on the Jewish Imaginary. But the person who's going to introduce him is a close friend and a colleague, Eitan Bar-Yosef, the chair of the Ben-Gurion Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics here at Ben-Gurion University. He's known for his research about the Holy Land in English culture. He published a very well-respected book here in Israel known as Villa Bajungel, Africa בתרבות הישראלית, jointly with Tel Aviv, Van Leer, and Kibbutz HaMeuchad. And he will introduce Professor Sicher to those of us who are not familiar with English literature and the role of Jews in English literature. So, Eitan, bevakasha.
Okay, thank you. I have a slight cold, so forgive us at times. So I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Professor Efraim Sicher, who is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics here at BGU. Efraim is a remarkably prolific scholar, combining a sweeping knowledge of British, Russian, American, and Israeli literatures with an interest in cutting-edge theoretical questions concerning memory and history, trauma studies, and constructions of the Jew. This impressive thematic and theoretical range is reflected in the various titles he has published in recent years. Under Postcolonial Eyes, The Jew in Contemporary British Writing, co-written with Linda Winehouse, this is 2012. An edited volume called Race, Color, Identity, Discourses about the Jews in the Early 21st Century, 2013. And that came out of an international conference that he organized here at BGU in 2010. And in addition, since 2003, he has published important books about Charles Dickens, Isaac Babel, and the Holocaust novel. And his most recent study, as Efraim said, Effie, is The Jew's Daughter, A Cultural History of a Conversion Narrative, published this year by Lexicon Books. And it is in the context of this book that he will speak today about conversion narratives in 19th century England. Before we turn to Efraim's paper, I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight the relationship between conversion and gender in Victorian culture by recounting two interesting episodes that figure in my own work on Christian Zionism. The first anecdote concerns a woman called Mary Seddon, who came from a respectable Wigston family in North England. For years, Seddon had been keenly interested in the return of the Israelites to their homeland. Finally, in 1823, she gathered some Jews, bought a white donkey, and started off for Jerusalem. She reached Calais, and some people say Paris, where she was abandoned by her little congregation. Her husband had to cross the channel and fetch her back to England, where she was committed to a lunatic asylum. One of her granddaughters, Georgina Meinershagen, remembered visiting, quote, the remarkable old lady who studied Hebrew and music, full of fun and kind-hearted to a degree, but also peculiar and flighty. But as Georgina's younger sister, Beatrice Webb, candidly explained, the whole affair, quote, was always referred to as a slur on our birth. Seddon was eventually released. Webb has written, quote, saying on all but one subject her special mission to lead the Jews back to Jerusalem. But she never returned to her husband, whom she could not mention without a shuddering memory of, quote, the horrors of an old-fashioned lunatic asylum. Years later, in 1862, the seventh Earl of Shaftesbury, that great evangelical reformer, narrated an anecdote, quote, to show that eminent men sometimes form their opinions as to the sanity of a patient on very flimsy evidence. And this is the story. Once when he was sitting on the Lunacy Commission as a chairman, the alleged insanity of a lady was under discussion. And he took a view of the case opposite to that of his colleagues. One of the medical men who was there to give evidence crept up to his chair and in confidential tone said, "Are you aware, my lord, that she subscribes to the Society for the Conversion of the Jews?" "Indeed," replied Lord Shaftesbury. "Are you aware that I am president of that society?" The expectation that the Jewish people would return one day to Palestine was, of course, central to the work of the society established in 1809. Both conversion and restoration, the exact order of events was often disputed, were a necessary prelude to the Second Coming. In 1840, in the wake of the Damascus affair and the international crisis concerning the future of Syria, Shaftesbury felt that the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land was at last imminent. He then famously urged the foreign minister Palmerston, also his stepfather-in-law, that's quite convenient, to encourage the Jewish colonization of Palestine as a policy that would benefit both Ottomans and the British. And one might imagine a delighted Mary Seddon following the developments from her confined cell. There are several things that these two anecdotes suggest. First, they capture the complex relationship between faith, conversion, class, and gender. Seddon and Shaftesbury share the same ideas, but he was celebrated as a great reformer and she was locked in. She was mad. He was merely eccentric. This leads to a second point. Ideas about the conversion of the Jews in Victorian Britain as part of the millenarian plan often existed on the fringe of respectability and were open to the charges of enthusiasm or, as we have seen, madness. This is important because historians such as Barbara Tuchman, Meir Verite, Donald Lewis, and others have tended to see Shaftesbury as one of the forerunners of the Christian Zionist tradition, which would eventually lead to the Balfour Declaration. And these accounts often read like a dot-to-dot drawing connecting Lord Shaftesbury, George Eliot, and Lawrence Oliphant with some of their lesser-known contemporaries, only to reveal in due course a neatly sketched draft of Balfour's letter to Lord Rothschild. As I've said, this rather simplified account tends to assume that the restoration and conversion projects throughout the 19th century were mainstream and respectable, and in doing so it tends to forget that when Jewish Zionism was still a distant dream, plans about Jewish restoration, and I would add conversion, were treated with ambivalence and suspicion. Indeed, what emerges so clearly from Ephraim's extensive study of conversion narratives is precisely how ideas about the Jews' conversion reflect anxieties and fantasies about British culture, identity, and nationality. Having said that, one cannot ignore the fact that Shaftesbury did have an important role in shaping Britain's political and diplomatic interests in the Middle East. The proximity between millenarian fantasies and Britain's actual presence in the Holy Land is also reflected in the stories of Mary Seddon's aforementioned granddaughters. One, Georgina Meinershagen, was the mother of Richard Meinershagen, the British intelligence officer who helped trick the Ottoman army exactly 100 years ago during the battle for Beersheba, which we've heard so much about recently. Her sister, Beatrice Webb, was of course an eminent socialist whose husband was Sidney Webb, Lord Passfield, who as colonial secretary issued the Passfield White Paper of 1930, one of the many twists and turns of British mandatory rule in Palestine. It's no wonder then that Mary Seddon's millenarian fantasies are still with us. 2 weeks ago, on the 7th of November, I attended a huge rally in London's Royal Albert Hall, one of the many events commemorating the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. This was a joint Jewish-Christian event associated mainly with what we would call Britain's evangelical community and held under the title Partners in This Great Enterprise. What was the restoration of the Jews to the land of their fathers was, of course, the central trope in this event. What was left out was, of course, the second part of the millenarian scheme, the conversion, which both sides prefer to play down and suppress. The Jews, to paraphrase Ephraim's title, are happy to embrace the Christians, but not necessarily to embrace Christianity. And I have no doubt that Professor Sicher's paper today will help us understand the origins and the various manifestations of these narratives of conversion, and I'm delighted to invite him to present his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Effie and Chaim for their stored work in running this series of seminars, which I have been assiduously attending for the last couple of years, so I don't really feel like a guest, but I am pleased I'm not so much an onlooker or bystander, but have the privilege to actually address you today. A particular thanks to Eitan for his very useful introduction, and before I go any further, thank you also to Noah. I'm not sure if she's here. Noah, Sylvie Corlair, my former postdoc, without whom this book would not have been completed. Noah has already addressed you on some of the aspects of this research, but today I'm going to talk about the narrative of the Jew and his daughter, and before I get to the conversion narratives of the 19th century, I'm going to give a very short introduction on where this narrative actually comes from, so that we'll see that by the time we get to the 19th century, the theological background, the motive to conversion to embrace Christianity has merged or got mixed up with the romantic motivation to embrace Christians. The Jew and his daughter is a binary pair. It's very important to understand that it's a gendered pair. We can't have the wicked, evil, ugly Jewish father without his beautiful, desirable and convertible daughter. And of course you will immediately realize that this goes back to the Pauline opposition of the old law, the new law, the olive tree, which has its roots in the old religion, but which has grafted onto the new religion, which supersedes it. Wicked, desirable, these are binary oppositions that operate throughout the centuries. This is also, of course, especially in the modern period, perceived as an image of Jewish exclusivity and refusal to accept both Christians and Christianity. Another point is that the Jew's daughter, it starts off by being an agent of Jewish evil, who then rebels against her father's wickedness. And of course, Abigail in Marlowe's Jew of Malta and Jessica in Merchants of Venice are the most well-known examples. The beautiful Jewess in this narrative is redeemed from Jewish misbelief by a Christian lover. And we'll perhaps discuss later on how this narrative becomes an erotic story. The other aspect which I deal with in the book is the image of Judea captor, the forsaken Jewess, weeping for her lost homeland, but fulfilling a Christian eschatology in which the destruction of Jerusalem is part of the divine plan to reveal Jesus as the Redeemer and to redeem the world with the second coming of that gentleman from Nazareth. Well, the Jew and his daughter. Well, any student who gets as far as the second year of study in this university will know that if you want to know anything, you just oops, that's not working.
Press enter.
Sorry?
Press enter.
Press enter. Okay, that's fine.
No, but you no, it's okay.
Okay. So what does the Jew and his daughter look like? This is okay. So the first thing you get when you Google the Jew and his daughter is this, and the other thing that you get in just thousands and thousands of matches is this. And that's not so much a joke, because bloggers have been hard at work suggesting that this is another Mordechai and Esther, if not for a time such as this. And indeed, in the Atlantic magazine, they took this very seriously after the 2016 elections. This is the whole insinuation of Jewish power behind the throne, and of course the ethnicity of the first daughter always comes out. There's always a whole discussion: is she keeping Shabbos? Did she do this? Did she do that? Is she speaking for the Jewish people? This is something that bloggers tend to spend the whole day discussing. But yes, Esther and Mordechai. Have we forgotten that this is a story about how the Jewess passes as a convert to save her people? Though in Christian versions, this is a story of salvation which prefigures the redemptive role of Mary as the Queen Intercessor. And of course, yes, Esther has been placed there by the wicked Jew father who is undermining the state by using the body of his daughter to get power and influence. The basic plot, of course, of the Jewess of Toledo legends in Spain, 16th century onwards up to the present day, and in Germany, Grillparzer and Volkswagen come to mind, and of course also Polish versions of the Esterka legend, as well as, of course, familiar anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But that's not the right story. In our story, it's the Jew father who has a beautiful daughter who converts to Christianity. You have the wicked Shylock and Jessica, who has plans of her own to elope with the Christian and defeat the wicked intentions of the Jew father to lock her up in his house and prevent her marrying a Christian who rightfully should inherit his property. Here we have Maurice Scott, the very well-known portrait of Shylock and Jessica, the romanticization of Shylock, now as a hero, right, for Gottlieb Lessing's Nathan the Wise and Shylock were in the pantheon of Jewish heroes. And notice that Jessica here is very sly, trying to get the key out of his pocket without him quite noticing. And of course, in late 20th century versions of The Merchants of Venice, Jessica becomes the rebellious Jewish daughter who's running away from her modern Orthodox father. You see this in many productions, rightfully marrying out the object of her love and doing away with the old-fashioned Jewish religion. The same narrative, but with a different ideological context. Now, if you look at the first handouts that you had, there were really two versions of the Jew and his daughter narrative. The first one I'm going to talk about very briefly is the Jew's daughter, a very famous English ballad, which you have in your handout, which might be called What Jews Do to Little Boys. And here's a 19th century engraving of that. This is a story, or rather a ballad, that has been very, very strong in English culture right up to the 20th century. In the 1970s, the Steel Eye Band, a rock band, produced a version of the Ballad of Little Hugh of Lincoln, or the Jew's Daughter, without the Jew's daughter, which made it even more insidious. There was some unnamed force that got hold of the little boy and emasculated him and killed him. This is, of course, a familiar story, and historically, in the blood libel of little Hugh of Lincoln, there was no Jew's daughter. The blood libel is based on the disappearance of a boy called Little Hugh in Lincoln in 1255, and as Gavin Lagrimer has shown, it really resulted from an intrigue fueled by the interests of local barons and expected profit from a martyr's cult for the local cathedral. In Matthew Paris's well-known account, there's no mention of a Jew's daughter. Here we have perhaps the best-known version of this ballad called Hugh of Lincoln and the Jew's Daughter. This version is actually a Scots version from the 18th century. I have not found medieval versions of this ballad, and I was asking myself, well, where does this idea of the Jew's daughter as a sole agent of evil come from? Well, if we look at the well-known 15th century woodcut of the blood libel of Simon of Trent, you'll notice that there is a Jewess, arrowed here, who is taking part. This is unusual in blood libels, where Jewish women at most are in the background. It's very unusual to see a Jewish woman actually taking part, but more obviously, this image of the blood libel that we see here in the case of Simon Trent was very often, especially in northern Italy, displayed opposite a painting of the Virgin Mary enthroned. And if you now look at the text in front of you, you will see very clear indications that this is a narrative that is being juxtaposed with a Marianic cult. First of all, if you look at the fourth stanza, the fifth stanza, she's taking her to the Jew's garden where the grass grew long and green. She's put an apple red and white to wile the pretty boy in. So obviously this is the evil Eve, the archetypal sexual danger of a woman who is seducing, luring little boy, little innocent virgin boy in. Of course, the Jewess or the seductress is still around with us today. On the next page, she wiled him in through a dark door, and through 9, she's laid him on a dressing table and sticked him like a swine. Again, the association of the Jew with the pig is familiar from the Judenzahl myth. And first came out the thick blood, and soon came out the thin, and soon came out the body heart's blood. There was no more within. And obviously I don't need to explain that this is of course a version of the crucifixion. She's rolled him in a cake of lead, bade him lie still and sleep. She's thrown him into Our Lady's draw well, was 50 fathom deep. Our Lady's draw well, the local well, is in this version, but not in all versions, called Our Lady's draw well. Again, the obvious association with Mary, who makes a miracle, and the boy speaks from the dead. And that is, of course, a story familiar to you from Chaucer's Primus' Tale, and the Primus actually references the story of the legend of Little Hugh of Lincoln at the end of that story. But there is no Jew's daughter. But if we notice, this is an anti-Mary. Just as you have the Virgin Mary who saves the boy, you have her counterpart, the wicked Jew's daughter who is crucifying him. So here the Jewess is the agent. The father is not seen. And very obviously an Madonna. Now, the second version you might call The Jew and His Beautiful Daughter, or simply The Jew's Daughter. And of course, inside on the roof, Ted is very worried about his daughter converting, but as well as, of course, there's always this worry that Jewish daughters are going to get raped by Cossacks in the pogrom. But in the European versions of the story, the wealthy, wicked Jew father tries to protect his beautiful daughter from exogamy and conversion, except that she is more than willing to embrace both the Christians and Christianity. And here we have a large number of exemplar in Latin, mainly in the Middle Ages. And if you look at your next handout, I've taken an example from perhaps the best known of them from the Dialogue of Miracles by Caesar of Eisenbach, 13th century. He has 4 stories or exemplar which feature Jews, but notice they are in a section called On Contrition. They are designed for the contrition of the Christian believer. The object of the target of conversion is the Christian and not the Jew. Here's a story which is repeated throughout the centuries. You find it in Germany in the 14th century Hans Volz. You find it in a novel by Grimmelhausen in the 17th century. A clerk tricks a Jewish family into believing that their daughter is going to give birth to a Messiah. Of course, he's been sleeping with the beautiful Jewish daughter, and the object of the exercise is to prove how ridiculous the Jews look and how ridiculous is their expectation that the Messiah will come, not believing that Jesus was the Messiah and has already come. On the first page, on the second column, it's very important to notice that the Jewish daughter is described as a maiden who has never known a man. Right? This lie that he gets the Jews to believe by pretending to be a heavenly voice through a tube. This tube figures in all the versions of this story. And the heavenly voice tells the parents, you must show great honour to your daughter and tend her with the greatest care. This is the highlighted passage. And preserve diligently the boy who shall be born from her virgin body, for he is the Messiah, whose coming you have so long expected. Of course, this assumes that Jews really acknowledge that Jesus was born of an immaculate conception, but perversely refuse to actually admit that. On the other hand, this is a deceit. This is a lie. And of course, when the child is born, it is a girl. As Hans Volz puts it, a Messiah with a slit. The Jews are being mocked for their incredulity and, of course, for their misbelief. On the next page, in the passage I have, I think it's outlined. At last, she brought forth an infant, and not indeed the Messiah, but a daughter. Notice that Messiah cannot be female. Notice that, I mean, all through the gendering of this narrative is very striking. When this became known, there was much confusion and trouble among the Jews, and one of them, wild with indignation, seized the poor baby by the foot and dashed it against the wall, which just proves how cruel and inhuman the Jews are. But of course, it's an anti-Annunciation story. However, it carries with it what Anthony Bales called an excess of sexuality. Why is this story being told? It's an exemplar, which is like a kind of anthology of exemplar for preachers to use as they go around converting Christians, helping them strengthen their faith. Of course, you could say that a Bible tale might draw an audience, But there is a very disturbing amount of sexuality, of the license given to the clerk to sleep with a Jewess, which is of course sinful. And of course, as a clerk, he's someone who should be remembering his vows of chastity. And the question is, why in this story there is no conversion of the Jewess novice? It was a miserable ending that an infidel maiden who had been seduced and ruined by a Christian man should not have been brought to baptism like the girl you told me of above. It was the previous story. Monk. Perhaps the clerk was really unable to bring that about, not an excuse, or more likely perhaps took no pains to do it, but rejoiced rather in the confounding of the Jews than in the enlightenment of the maiden. So there you have it. It's more important to prove how ridiculous the Jews are, how stupid they are as misbelievers, than actually to bring about the conversion of the Jew's daughter. But why is the Jew's daughter always desirable and convertible? Couldn't we just say she's a misbeliever, has to be converted? Why the sexual attraction of the Jew's daughter? Well, first of all, among German humanists, it was very clear that the Jewess was more than willing to sleep with a Christian man, because, as Heinrich Bebel tells us in one of his anecdotes, any Jewess will tell you that they much prefer to sleep with a Christian because he has what a Jewish man doesn't have. But what's interesting about this anecdote is the way that Bebel, I'm not sure if you can actually read it, Bebel makes a connection between baptism and circumcision, as if these are two paths to salvation, one the true path, one the false path. But the reason why circumcision is rejected as a path of salvation is because it doesn't satisfy the Jewish woman, and she prefers the Christian man, not so much because he's baptized, but because he has what she needs to satisfy her. Medical knowledge at the time also confirmed that Jewish women derived more pleasure from sexual intercourse with uncircumcised men, and that's Bartholin in 1672, standard medical textbook. Chateaubriand in the 19th century is drawing on a legend that Jewesses are not cursed with physical deformity as male Jews were, for abusing Jesus, and that's why they're also beautiful. I think in medieval, the roots of this legend lies the idea that Jewish women identified with Mary as a mother, and as women they sympathized with Jesus. But I haven't been able to find many examples of this idea before the 19th century. Chateaubriand is actually responding to the beautiful Jewess of Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, to which I will return in a minute. So there's definitely a romantic element in the narrative when we get to the 19th century. Now, I want to look briefly at a few examples of narratives of the Jew's daughter in the early 19th century, which offer a variety of responses to the political question of Jewish emancipation, but which also address larger questions of the relation of religion to national identity. In some of these narratives, the Jew's daughter converts, confirming the author's religious and political conservatism or fervent messianism. In others, no conversion takes place, and the beautiful Jewess rejects marriage with a Christian, or turns out not to be Jewish by birth, thus averting the danger of miscegenation and protecting the entity of the nation. I'm not interested so much in what conversion does to the convert's identity. I want to know what conversion narratives say about Englishness, who is excluded and why, and whether, given the fundamental political, demographic and socio-economic changes in English society, the rules could change, with all that this implies for constructions of national identity. In an age when intermarriage and conversion were on the increase among well-placed English Jews, though not widespread or representative, the contemplation of intermarriage with or without conversion becomes a topical question of social acceptance and religious tolerance. And don't forget that Jews in England, unlike the Jews in America, were not fully emancipated until 1858. While Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice remains the raw text of the Jewish father-daughter pair, it becomes eclipsed by the story of the essentialized beautiful Jewess who is expected to convert both for reasons of cultural and social assimilation and in order to comply with the condition of Christian tolerance. Conversion novels that followed Walter Scott's Ivanhoe of 1819 continue to read Christian typology into the Jew's daughter narrative and to counter Scott's construction of race and nation with a plea for conversion that would redeem the persecuted Jew as part of the salvation of the Christian nation in the restoration of Zion. The restoration of Zion was a cornerstone of evangelical belief, though not necessarily a practical plan for the resettlement of the Jews in the land of Israel, which was often dismissed as a lunatic idea, as Eitan has just told us. This is not what we would call Shivat Zion. The restoration of Zion, however it was conceived, did not necessarily encompass advocacy of equal rights for Jews and followed a Christian eschatology in fulfillment of the Hebrew prophets and the Christian scriptures, which would lead to the conversion of all Jews and the universal reign of Christianity in the Second Coming. However, many urged better treatment of the Jews on the assumption that Jews were less likely to maintain their separate religious identity if legal restrictions were removed and thus more likely to convert. Some, like the Romantic essayist and critic William Hazlitt, supported the emancipation of the Jews based on the Enlightenment idea of a common humanity. Other supporters of emancipation, like the Quaker prison reformer Elizabeth Fry, thought that Jews would be better than many nominal Christians in pursuing the Christian principles of government. The historian Thomas Babington Macaulay challenged the defenders of discrimination in Parliament, but resorted to a Benthamite principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number when he called for a new inclusive definition of nation that was no longer Christian and tolerated all creeds and faiths. And this was still a little bit far ahead of his time, because England is still today a Christian nation. The Queen is head of the church, and at this time definition of inclusion in the nation depended on the person being a Christian, and before the emancipation of the Catholics in 1829 and the removal of disabilities from the dissenters, a Protestant member of the Anglican Church. The failed attempts at Jewish emancipation up to 1858 cannot be divorced, however, from the history of toleration of Catholics and dissenters, or from the emancipation of the Jews in revolutionary France, just across the water. The English insist on calling the English Channel. Nor should the discussion of the image of the Jew in this period be restricted to a consideration of anti-Semitism or philo-Semitism, but should be considered in the context of the erosion of established religious institutions and the breakdown of class divisions against the background of urbanization, industrialization, and lower class political agitation. An example of the missionary turn in the narrative of the Jew's daughter is the Jew and his daughter. And I did try and copy one example of this, but it didn't come out very well, and I'll just pass it around just to give you an idea of a narrative that was very, very popular in the 1820s, circulated on both sides of the Atlantic. It's very, very difficult to read. I did enlarge the text, but I don't think that's any better. I'll just pass around the enlargement. But just to give you an idea of this kind of magazine or newspaper article, which appeared with very many other missionary texts aimed at the general population, in this case the Zion Herald, an American newspaper mainly for sailors, and ascribed to the Church of England magazine, which was a magazine, a British magazine of the Episcopal Church, not the Anglican Church. So it's not something that's just restricted to evangelical missionary narratives, but you find it very, very broadly crosses backwards and forwards across the Atlantic from the 1820s. One example is a very small chapbook about the size of my hand, published several times, and a few printings in Dublin at a printer notorious for pirating other people's books. So it was obviously very, very much in circulation. It was retold many times, partly in verse and partly in prose. For some reason the prose version is set in Virginia. We could perhaps ask in the discussion why Virginia. I have my own ideas. And it tells of a much beloved Jew's daughter, his only companion after his wife's death, who dies tragically from consumption. On her deathbed, the Jew's daughter, declares her sins have been washed away by Jesus, and she makes her father swear he will convert, which he does. Her death is the, quote, chastening rod that he kisses, thankful for the divine mercy in showing the way to repent of the Jews' error in rejecting and despising Jesus. The story ends with love and compassion for the repentant Jew. The version in prose appeals directly to Christian readers to learn from the tale, reminding us of the task of these narratives to convert Christians as well as Jews who are living witnesses to the mission of Jesus, as they had been present then and were now dispersed in exile among Christians to testify to their own unique role in Christian eschatology. As the London-based Apostolic Church of England magazine exhorted its readers in an issue that included the Jew and his daughter, the Jew was the channel of salvation, citing John chapter 4 verse 22, which tells of Jesus' conversion of a Samaritan woman and foretells a future time when all will join in the spiritual worship of God. Like many conversion narratives, the Jew and his daughter primarily targeted Christians, exhorting them to be inspired by the example of the Jew's daughter and understand that their strengthening of faith would facilitate the restoration of the sign. In conversion narratives such as the Jew's daughter, the Jewess cannot usually be allowed to live because her beauty poses a sexual threat to male authority and to Christian chastity. Any Christian suitor must realize that she is marrying Jesus, not a mortal Christian. Moreover, her death fulfills her redemptive role according to Christian interpretations of the Hebrew prophets and of Jewish history, which taught that conversion of the Jews was an essential stage in precipitating the promised return of the resurrected Jesus. Memoir of Maria, a converted Jewess of 1844, is a typical conversion narrative that urges the Christian reader to learn from the example of the Jewess who came to believe in Jesus through her physical suffering and was redeemed in death. The typological reading of the Hebrew Bible presents it as the key to Christian scriptures, which only unconverted Jews are blind to. And Mariah's blindness in this story symbolically leads her to see the inner spiritual light. The effective telling of the story of a beautiful death brings about the conversion of the father and other Jews who have up to now persecuted the convert, so that her death can be presented as a kind of martyrdom. In many of these narratives, the Jewess herself proselytizes even when dying. Dressed up as authentic memoirs or edited autobiographies, these conversion tracts tried to persuade Jews that there was no contradiction between the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures. After all, missionaries tried to convince Jews that Christianity was merely the perfection of Judaism, so that the conversion of the Jew's daughter was a natural completion of the transformation of the old law into the new and the redemption of the daughter of Jerusalem. Even novels were often the only literature recommended as suitable for female readers, and the nonconformist Daniel Defoe, himself persecuted for his beliefs, is one example of an author who used the novel as a vehicle for the religious conversion of his readers by telling them a story from real life of sin and repentance. The story, for example, of Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, who is emblematically an everyman who carries a cross, came to be a foundation text in literary realism, but serves also as a parable of conversion to faith, his own, the heathens, and the readers. For this reason, it is not surprising that conversion narratives such as The Jew and His Daughter inspired novels like Charlotte Anley's Miriam, or The Power of Truth, a Jewish tale of 1826. Miriam is touched by the love of her friend Helen Stewart and is driven by curiosity as to the authority by which Jesus was claimed to be the Messiah. Anley rehearses here the Christian arguments in refutation of the Cambridge Hebrew scholar Rabbi Jewish Krul's answer to the missionaries, seeing in the widowed Jewish father's bigoted obstinacy to recognize Jesus the reason Israel is being punished and still in exile. See the logic here. Jews are being persecuted for a very good reason, because they're being punished by God. This is a favourite missionary proof that persecution and suffering are testimony to the Jews' own sins in not converting. After Miriam's death, her father Imla is so affected by his daughter's conversion that he proves himself a zealous missionary, travelling through the Middle East to convert the souls of his brethren. Such novels that followed the Jew's daughter narrative often claimed to show great insight into Jewish traditions, though as usual their knowledge was biased or distorted. Solomon, the Jewish father in Amelia Bristow's novel Sophia de Lissow, 1824, features a Jew-daughter pair, but this enlightened Jewish businessman holds tolerant attitudes towards Christians, though he later deteriorates, in the author's view, into deism, and reads not only Voltaire, but horror, also Tom Paine. The author's ire is turned towards the bigoted grandfather who clings to Jewish rituals and superstitions, and the family's resident rabbi, the surrogate patriarchal father figure. The family takes its name from the Prussian city of Lissow in post-partition Poland, from whence they moved to London. Sophia is estranged from her older sister, the apostate and proselytizing Emma, who has been brought up by her grandparents and is kidnapped by her mother and haunted cruel Rabbi Kolmar, who demonstratively strangles a goldfinch as Emma is struck down bleeding. Well, kidnapping by fanatic Jews is a favourite motive of conversion literature, and Emma is sent away to work as a domestic servant. However, the mild-mannered, kindly father Solomon restores Emma to the family home, yet he cannot prevent his wife, the traditional matriarch Anna, from educating Sophia strictly in Jewish practice, which she takes to with impressive sincerity. Sophia resists Emma's attempt to convert her and rejects out of hand a marriage proposal from a believing Christian. Sophia suffers in silence her profligate husband Leonie's abuse and his accusations of apostasy. Predictably, consumption only adds to the beauty of the young Jewess, and she dies in childbirth, clinging to the last to the faith of her ancestors, and ignoring Emma's gospel preaching, as well as her warning that death awaits those who persist in their misbelief. This twist in the conversion narrative leaves the Jew's daughter unconverted, but nevertheless leaves the reader with a distinct impression that as long as Jews consult the Bible, they may deserve the respect of Christians. On the assumption that reading the Hebrew Bible, the source of Christian exegesis, would bring them round on the basis of typology to believe in Jesus. Now, the splitting of the Jew's daughter into two protagonists, Sophia and Emma, indicates the death of oneself and the rebirth of the author's alter ego in the sequel, the story of the converted Emma, Emma de Lissow, published in 1828. And again, this is a book that was published on both sides of the Atlantic and went through many editions. Moreover, the distinction between the ambivalent portrayal of the Jewish father and the other bigoted Christian-hating Jews plays out the familiar prejudiced view of Jewish intolerance and misbelief. It is made clear that the unrepentant Jews living in isolation, a nation within a nation, are blameworthy as a stumbling block to the establishment of the longed-for peace of Jerusalem. While appearing, it's familiar, isn't it? While appearing to have some knowledge of the authentic beliefs of Polish Jews, the author has no patience for hypocritical and vulgar English Jews. Bristow makes clear from the beginning that her biased Christian interpretation of Jewish history is that of sinful backsliders justly punished for rejecting belief in Jesus. Though the lesson is equally directed at the Christian reader, and particularly those, quote, nominal Christians, who are no better than wayward and ignorant Jews. This is her response to the debate over Jewish emancipation, which was renewed with the legislation to remove discrimination from dissenters and Catholics. The conversionist novel made baptism a condition of social acceptance and resisted this changing conception of the nation. To accept membership in the Christian nation, Jews had to reject Judaism and to abandon the Jewish home. In other words, Jews were to be tolerated only once they were no longer Jews. Born Amelia Solomon, Bristow is a rather neglected author of conduct books and conversion novels that may be autobiographical. We're not very sure about her background. She has recently been rediscovered by feminists, but her writing betrays typical evangelical attitudes towards conversion in confessional or pseudo-autobiographical tales of a Jewess, which, with their copious notes, reduce the Jews to an object of knowledge for the better understanding of how to enlighten Jews in the faith of Jesus, an essential task in the Millennial Project. It is an example of how missionaries targeted Jewish women with stories of violent abuse and domestic suffering in a patriarchal Jewish household, to which they contrasted the love of Christianity, on the assumption that docile Jewish women would rebel at their submission to paternal authority if they were attracted by an ideal middle-class domesticity, and that their deficient Jewish education would render them more open to the love and spirituality offered by Christian readings of the Hebrew Bible. The solution of the conversion narrative, as in Lessing's play Nathan the Wise, does not confirm marriage with a Jewess to be a socially accepted option, or indeed a solution to the problem of emancipation. On the contrary, in her novel Harrington of 1817, Maria Edgeworth proposes a solution similar to Lessing's, that toleration without requiring conversion might be a better way of acknowledging that the Jews have their own path to salvation. Rather, as in Lessing's play, the ending obviates the question of conversion for marriage entirely. As you remember, Recha in Nathan the Wise turns out not to have been Jewish after all, and here Berenice turns out also not to have been a Jewess, but she has been merely brought up by a very tolerant and enlightened Jew. But Walter Scott was very relieved to find out that Berenice was not a Jewess. He was very worried when he got to the end of the novel, and believed that these Jew stock jobbers were not being contemplated as possible members of the nation. In his own Ivanhoe, as you remember, there is a romance between Ivanhoe and Rebecca, which cannot possibly take place in terms of English society of the early 19th century, let alone medieval England. So Scott ships her off to Cordova, and rather anonymously, skipping a couple of centuries to the rule of Boabdil, and preferring Muslim Spanish tolerance to English hatred and intolerance, but of course obviating the need to explain how a Jewess could marry a Christian. And then Rebecca, of course, is, as I mentioned already in the quote from Chateaubriand, the exemplar of the beautiful Jewess whose orientalized image crops up again and again and again in England, France, and many other countries to the present day. Let's perhaps just summarize at this point. In Lessing's Nathan the Wise, there's no conversion. Edgeworth's Harrington, 1817, no conversion. Scott's Ivanhoe, no conversion. In Bulwer Lytton's Lila, 1838, story set in medieval Spain, the daughter is sacrificed by the wicked Jew to avoid her conversion. In fact, she's been having a love affair with a Muslim, which is strangely resonant of the ending of the very, very popular opera by Scribe and Halevi, La Juive, of 1835, where the Jew Elazar sacrifices his own daughter before revealing to the bishop that she's in fact his daughter. Skipping ahead, of course, George Eliot's Daniel Deronda of 1876 reverses these conversion narratives by having Daniel Deronda, an Englishman, discover that he is a Jew, a kind of moral conversion, and marry the beautiful Myra. But she does have a very wicked Jewish father, so Eliot seems to have it both ways, to keep to the traditional narrative, but also to question it and reformulate it. Here we are. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Jewish father tends to fall into the background, perhaps because of emancipation. Emancipation is no longer an issue after 1858 in England, and also in Germany after 1868. But curiously, the story of the Jewish father, not necessarily wicked, and the daughter who wants to marry a Christian still persists in the ideological context of emancipation and social acceptance. And Augustine Daly's They Are the Forsaken of 1862 was adapted from Mosenthal's Deborah of 1849, an Austrian play very much responding to the debate in Austria about Jewish emancipation, and suggesting that Jews would only be accepted on Christian terms. Deborah is in love with a local Christian, local gentleman who marries a child of love, and she is forsaken. So Taylor names the play Leah the Forsaken. Again, think of Capta, the forsaken Jewess, always in exile, unredeemed. And this was a very popular play around 1862. In fact, Sarah Bernhardt, at the end of the century, performed a French version of the play on the American stage. And as you can see in this turn of the century postcard, it's very unclear whether she is the crucified Leah or the crucifying Jewess. Either way, she is the vengeful Juif fatale. The femme fatale has become la Juif fatale. In fact, we find at the end of the century some kind of confusion about whether the femme fatale is really a Jewish evil threatening men. Certainly the followers of the Drummond school of anti-Semitism in France saw in this performance by Sarah Bernhardt proof of the threat of Jewish women to white European masculinity, spreading syphilis, and the awful, dreaded Moroccan belly dance, as one of them put it. But here I would suggest that we're going back to the Jewess as sole agent of evil, the anti-Mary we saw in the ballad of Little Hugh of Lincoln. Of course, the Juif fatale has, since the end of the 19th century, been striking back with a vengeance. And in post-Holocaust versions, as you can see, we've got used to the idea of the vengeful Jewess. Howard Jacobson ends his novel Shylock Is My Name of 2016 about a modern-day dialogue of a Jewish father with Shylock, by imagining what a contemporary Jessica would say after eloping with a Goy, and discovering that her Christian lover is both anti-Semitic and boring out of bed. He has her, quote, Malvolio in Twelfth Night, quote, "I will be revenged on the pack of you." But where is the Jewish father? He seems to have completely disappeared by 2014, when Anya Rose, in her take on Klimt's Judith 1 and Judith 2, suggests that the response to assimilation and anti-Semitism is to write back to the stereotypes, to combine, as Klimt did, Salome and Judith with La Juive Fatale in an assertive female sexuality liberated from all father figures. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this tour de force. And I open the floor for questions and comments. Please.
I was curious more about in terms of the general background, 19th century England. Do you have any way of evaluating the forces between the Enlightenment, the Reform, and the liberalization of Christianity and the evangelical who were Christianizing? Percentages or any indication?
Well, I think Eitan can probably say more about the evangelical background and the background of Hebrew Christianity, Hebrew Zionism, Christian Zionism, sorry. But I think, as I suggested, it's a very mixed picture. I think it's not so much about Jews, it's about English nation, who belongs, and that's a question that has caused some civil wars in England, and in fact is still a question which we will see spinning out when Ad Mea V'Esrim, Elizabeth II, passes on, and the question will be who will be the next in line. Is a question because the monarch is nominally the head of the church, but increasingly England is becoming liberal, enlightened, and moving away from the idea that citizenship should be linked to religion. And I think these stories, which have such a long lineage, come back because they are useful in a new ideological context. That is to say, Scott is not just talking about whether the English originate in the Celts or the Saxons, or whether Norman conquest was a good thing, but he's also talking about how Scots and English form part of the new British nation under the Union Act of 1707, and it's very important in English politics, especially for Scott, to assert the integration of the various nations which make up Britain, but he excludes Jews, and that's the point. Repeatedly we've seen these narratives that conversion either doesn't take place or the Jewess has to die, because at the end of the day the answer is no. The Jews are not socially acceptable, they're not theologically acceptable, they are upstarts, they're parvenu. We get this in Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now, much later in the century, even after emancipation.
And it doesn't matter whether they're right-wing, conservative, traditional Christians or reforming, liberalizing Christians.
Well, I'm not sure whether we can talk about liberals and right-wing in today's terms. Obviously, these narratives are being written to sell, and when you want to sell a novel, you need some erotic interest. I think it's true also today, and a beautiful Jewess can be very useful. But certainly in terms of politics, the exclusion of the beautiful Jewess, certainly in England, and a very different way in France, where Jews were already emancipated, I think does point to a political conservatism with a small c. Yes.
So I have a question and an observation. Start with the observation that if you take the long story of this motif, so in the beginning we have the evil father, the evil Jewish father that comes up in all kinds of contexts. Sarah can tell us a lot more about that in art and in story. And then we have the combination of the father and daughter, and then at the end you said that we only have the daughter left, which is a very interesting way of how things move. And the second thing is, in these narratives, is there any kind of mirroring to good Christian girls in England? Is she held up as a moral, you don't act this way, or if the Jewess can be so pious at the end, so can you? How does the Jewish daughter use vis-a-vis Christian young women?
Thank you. And as I said, it's very important to come back to this question of what happened to the evil, wicked Jewish father. Is certainly becoming much more mild-mannered, even enlightened already in Lessing's play. And certainly in 19th and 20th century novels, he becomes a kind of impediment to the Christian getting hold of the woman and the ducats, the gold, and really doesn't have an existence beyond that plot device. So I would suggest that, firstly, the theological motivation of the narrative has faded away, and we don't need to have this binary opposition of father, daughter, old law, new law, because who cares about the new law anymore? Most Europeans are not particularly Christian believers, and sometimes very irreverent. So that's, I think, one answer. I think also because literature has changed, and as I said just now, the plot of the erotic object is part of male fantasies, and you get this also after the Holocaust. You have, for example, in a German production of the Temple and the Jewess, which is a German opera by Marschner based on Ivanhoe. You have a scene of a Nazi officer and the abject Jewess kneeling on the floor in front of him. So you don't need the father. The main thing is the Jewess as the abject object of sexual desire, and that, of course, is very attractive still to this day. And as I said, the response to that from Jewish feminists in particular has been to reverse that relationship and have the Jewess as the dominant partner, and to actually shoot back at the Nazis, as we saw in Inglourious Bastards. The second question about the Jewess as a moral example to good Christian girls. Certainly, as I mentioned briefly, these conversion novels of the 1820s were actually selling the converted Jewess as an example of ideal domesticity and the virtue of Christianity. Even at the end of Scott's Ivanhoe, we find that Rebecca has gone to Spain and is exercising virtue in a very Christian way, carrying out acts of charity and so on and so forth. So this is a very Christian ideal, but also a middle-class English ideal of how Christian female readers should emulate the converted Jewess. And by the way, Jewish novelists like Grace Aguilar in The Vale of Cedars, who respond to these missionary narratives, end up actually selling the very same ideology of female domesticity, domestic virtue, and all the other trappings of good bourgeois home that is patriotic and anglicized. Yes, question at the back.
First Nadia, and then...
Okay. Well, I would like to ask, observe something that is a bit outside our discussion. But, you place all the examples in the narrative style. I mean, we are talking, after all, about fiction and about images, and not about necessarily about reality. And what I would like to ask is how much of this is really the fruit of anti-Semitism or philo-Semitism or other considerations, and how much it is what you mentioned in passing, an exotic notion of the foreign woman, who is on one way tempting and beautiful and strange and somewhat inaccessible. And I would like just to throw one little idea, I don't know. For example, the figure of the Muslim woman in medieval Spain is also foreign, desirable, and so on. And by the way, she appears also in Hebrew Spanish poetry, but I won't go into this. So we have here the ideal of a foreign, exotic female, which in this context, she's a Jewess because the Jews are the only foreign, exotic people living in England in this time. So what would you say?
Indeed. Well, firstly, the whole relationship of fiction and history. And I think what's interesting about a lot of these fictional narratives is how much they show the historical context of ideological discourses about nationhood, religion, identity, and so on. That's very true, I think, for Scott's Ivanhoe, and better scholars than I have written about that. And I think it's true of any fiction that's published. It's never published in a vacuum, and it always has its context there. The Forsaken, for example, which was first starred Kate Bateman as a tragic role, becomes taken over by Sarah Bernhardt, and there you have the femme fatale just playing it to the hilt. This whole question of Sarah Bernhardt as an exotic Jewess, or a consumptive Jewess, and a lot's been written about that. And today, starting in October 2017, this play is a play from 1862. There, The Forsaken is revived in New York. It's playing today in New York. I thought that's odd. Haven't we moved on since 1862? And it turns out that Leah the Forsaken, this vengeful woman, is now part of a different discourse directed against Donald Trump's limitation of the entry of refugees to the United States. And this is, of course, an example of what happens to Muslim refugees, the Muslim other, if you lock them out of your nation and don't give them refuge. And this is, of course, what happens in the original play by Rosenthal Daly's adaptation. The Jews are rejected, they move on somewhere else, and eventually end up in the United States. And so it's strange how these fictional narratives have historical resonance even in the present day. And of course, yes, the Jewess as a type of Muslim other, that I think is very much in vogue at the moment, emptying the narrative of the Jew's daughter of its original meaning, but giving it a new ideological context. And of course, the woman as exotic. Right? I think a lot of research has been done among Germans, for example, of their conception of the Jewess as an abject victim of the Nazis, but they are attracted to exotic foreign women, Muslims, but also the Jewesses. And I've actually been told this by a German who married an Israeli woman of Iraqi Jewish background. So there's always, I think, as has been pointed out by Robert J.C. Young, there's always a desirable attraction in the other, some kind of Freudian impulse in men that attracts them to the exotic, the dark other. So yes, you're right, there is definitely a connection there, and I've written in the book about this racial hierarchy of the white, the Jewess, and the black Moorish woman in French colonial North Africa, and I think there are also parallels in Spanish stories about North African Jewesses.
Yes, Sophie.
My question is somehow related, okay?
Yes.
And that is the Catholics. They are not as other than the Jews are others because they're the most others. Now the Catholics in England, because privately I'm just reading Dickens' Barnaby Rudge, and by coincidence, and there is a Catholic daughter of a Catholic, and he is quite the father is quite rough, although he's, as far as I understood until now, I'm not finished, but he seems to be a good one. I don't know. Is there anything comparable in the slightest to this pattern of Jewish father and women to like in British context to a Catholic woman and father or whatever? Are there any such stories?
I'm not aware of such stories, but as I think I mentioned briefly, the narrative of the Jew and his daughter was actually used as part of anti-Catholic polemic. The early 19th century narrative was very critical of how Catholic Spain had tried to convert the Jews through torture. We find this as repeatedly in English literature, this criticism of using violence instead of tolerance to convert Jews. But the Protestant way, of course, is better. It's more enlightened. You convert Jews by being nice to them. You kill them with kindness, as the historian Jeffrey Altman has put it. So yes, the Catholic element does exist as a kind of foil in these narratives, but I don't really know enough about the image of the Catholic woman as such.
Yes. I think that this question of Jewish women, conversion, etc., has to do also with another dimension, which is law. Because what seems to characterize women in patriarchal religions, that they are beyond the law, whereas the males, they embody the law. In other ways, the attractions to women coming from other religions is not only due to sexuality, etc. It is true, exoticism, but because they embodied a kind of universal, a common ground universal who transcends the law, if we compare to a much more rigid male idea of bringing the law to the home, to the house. Yes, this is a general remark, but if I may, I want to add two very interesting informations. First, you mentioned that according to Chateaubriand, Ivanhoe Rebecca embodied the beautiful Jewess. I remember that Chateaubriand was involved together with the Archbishop of Paris in a party in which they invited the very famous French Jewish actress, Rachel Felix, and they wanted to convert her publicly by reciting a very specific monologue in Racine's Phèdre. And then Rachel, understanding what is going on, she said, sorry, I prefer another of Racine's piece. And she choose an excerpt of Racine Esther, following not the Bible, not the Jewish Bible, but the Septuaginta Bible, in which Esther, she's pleading not only for the salvation of the Jews, but she's very proud to stay as a Jewess. This is the first, I think, very interesting, continuation of your information. And concerning Drummond, let's remember, in his La France Juive, La Femme Fatale, in fact, was not only Sarah Bernhardt. He claimed that Jewish women, they were known as very good prostitutes. And of course, he was taking into account what was going on concerning Jewish immigrants from the east to Western Europe. But for Drummond, these Jewish prostitutes, they were working for Jewish men, for the Jewish like elders of Zion, like kind of plot. And this has to do also with these shifts and the syphilis, of course.
Yes, syphilis.
Yeah. This shift in the image of Jewish women. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for those comments. First, as I think I emphasized, the 19th century English missionary tracts and novels really sold this idea that Judaism was a patriarchal religion, as we saw in the examples I gave. The Jewish father is wicked not just inherently, but because he represents patriarchalism and the alternative, the attractive alternative to Jewish women. And I'm not sure how the Jewish women were convinced by this, was to become a Christian and be a Christian woman in the middle class Christian home.
Which wasn't patriarchal.
So?
Which wasn't patriarchal.
Well, that's, as I was going to say, as if the Christian home was not patriarchal. But this has to do with middle class domesticity and the whole ideology of the domestic ideology of mid-19th century or early mid-19th century Europe, not just England, but also Germany and France. And by the way, feminists have taken this up. Judaism is bad because it's a patriarchal religion, and scratch a little bit and you'll find some very anti-Semitic discourse behind that. In other words, Judaism invented patriarchy, therefore it has to be attacked in the name of feminism, and this has been written about. Chateaubriand, yes, there was a lot going on there, and I didn't want to talk about Rachel, who also, by the way, appears in Daniel Deronda, and Myra is compared with that consumptive Jewish actress, Rachel, who is, of course, part of a father-daughter plot herself. In running against her father, she takes up a career in the French theatre. But Esther, at this time, particularly in the 1830s, there are also Jewish authors in England who take up the Esther plot in the Purim-Spiel and turn it around, showing that, and I give examples in the book, showing that the attempt to convert the Jewess is foiled as part of a Purim-Spiel. In the end, the Jewess actually manages to redeem herself and her people, and there are quite a few examples of that from the 1830s from a Jewish perspective. And there are also, of course, Christian versions in England and America showing just the opposite, that the Esther plot is a story of redemption that will lead to the restoration of Zion. So you have both versions of that Esther story. And Drummond, yes, and Drummond and others of his ilk spread this idea that Jews prostituted their own daughters or Jewish girls, and that was an idea that became very, very strong in France, and it was in Germany. There's even a German film called Juden von Sosnowitz, which actually showed Jewish fathers at the railway station in Eastern Europe sending their white slaves to corrupt decent German officers and coming as far as Berlin. A film that was actually banned at one time because of its pornographic scenes, and of course the Nazis took up some of these ideas. Yes, Jews, according to Drummond and his followers, spread syphilis, and that, as Senator Gilman has shown, was very much a fear among white European Christian males of this new woman, the suffragettes, the proto-feminists who demanded liberation, emancipation of modern society, and were felt to be threatening men with their new sexuality. Think of Jewish film stars of the early 20th century, like what's her name, Thea Bara, Jewish vamp. The Salome cult was full of these ideas that somehow the Salome Judith type is emasculating men. They are both stories of women, Judith and Salome. They're both stories of women who decapitate men, emasculation. In feminist versions of those stories, we find how it's been turned around. It's a dominant female, feminine dominatrix who emasculates the man in many postmodern versions of that painting. One example is Anya Rose, who gives a Jewish feminist version of the same story. So things have changed since Drummond. Pour ça change, pour ça, c'est la même chose.
I would like to ask you about immigration. One of the things that is happening in English society, especially in the second half of the 19th century, is the rise in the visibility of Judaism and Jews, and also the shift within English Jewry from a predominantly Sephardi older cohort, which is, as you also pointed out, being slightly more assimilated, and a very visible Ashkenazi presence that has all the tropes of Jewish visibility. Does that register in the material that you've been looking at?
Certainly in Mariah Edgeworth's Harrington, the plot revolves around an Englishman, Harrington, who is exposed to anti-Semitism from an early age. He has a nursemaid who frightens him with this bogey of the old clothes man. So the old Sephardic wealthy banker has been replaced by the impoverished German schmatter seller, right, who goes around the little villages and always wears a number of hats. There's always caricatures and pumps and other magazines as the old clothes man, spreading infection from the clothes that he's selling, but also with a large bag on his back to capture little boys, and we all know what Jews do to little boys, and then Harrington goes to see a performance of Merchants of Venice. The Jessica character, or his friend, falls in love with the Jessica character. He himself falls in love with a beautiful Jewess. So it's a kind of exemplary tale that tries to reverse the anti-Semitic discourse about the new German Jewish peddler and the crude anti-Semitism which we're having in Coleridge, for example. Rats in the Table talk about the old clothes man as the antitype of Isaiah, the prophets. You have also, coming back to Noah's point about the Irish, a fear of Irish immigration into England, which is a threat not just of capitalism but also of unwashed, dirty labourers spreading disease and crime in the big cities. Very real threat that was felt in the big cities in 1820s and 1830s, and I think this also ties in with this fear of the other and anti-Catholic prejudice combined with anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish prejudice. So yes, immigration is very much the bogey in a lot of journalism and writing of 1830s, 1840s in England. Mariah Edgeworth herself was of Anglo-Irish origin, so she's very keen to push the case for Irish integration into English culture. Justice Scott was interested in merging the Scot and the English in a very romanticised form. So this is a big part of her own agenda. She believed that novels had a very important role in education, that people who read novels would be converted, so they're just as good as any missionary tract, except that she was trying to convert them to a modern secular idea of multi-racial and multi-religious nation, but couldn't quite include the Jewess, who in fact goes off not to Cordova's in Scott's novel, but to America. And why America? Coming back to my question about Virginia before, because in America Jews are tolerated and they're protected by law, and this is just unthinkable in England in the 1820s. In fact, a young American woman called Rebecca Rebecca Mordecai, I apologise. Rebecca Mordecai wrote to Maya Edgeworth complaining about her anti-Semitic image of a Jew called Mr. Mordecai in another novel of hers. And Edgeworth writes back in a very famous letter to Miss Mordecai in America, apologising, saying she will make amends in her next novel, which is, of course, Harrington. So there is a dialogue going on there between Jews and non-Jewish novelists, but also an awareness that this kind of prejudice is out of date. That's one of the messages of Harrington, that we as a British nation are now enlightened and liberal, and we don't do things like that, like pull Jews' teeth out as in the medieval age, because of. However, at the end of the day, they're not so able to fully assimilate the Jewish other.
Kill them with kindness. Yes. A couple of questions as well. One that goes back to the introduction, Eitan's introduction, and then your paper, where we seem to have two very different discourses. I'm sure you didn't beforehand. You didn't
coordinate. No.
Right, coordinate. But it seems, and perhaps I'm being too simplistic, right? But on the one hand, we have a political view of the Jews that fit into a much larger political theological outlook on Britain, English identity, how the English relate to the book, right, the Bible, and therefore how they should and what they should do with regard to the Jews, right? And on the other hand, we find these images, which of course are very old and go back to as you pointed out, right? But seem to remain within the sphere of the house. Right, domesticity, right, yes. Not so political in the sense that, I mean, I didn't gather from you that there was that much sort of political, theological ideas that came out of these books. They were mainly talking about society, right, and whether in the house or outside of the boundaries, but within the sort of framework of the family and within society. So that was one point. I don't know whether you want to comment on that. The second point is, and you sort of hinted to it at the end, but that readership. Right? Yes. Who's reading these books, and what do the reviewers have to say? There was I presume that some of these books are being talked about or reviewed, and what do the reviewers have to say about these? How are they received?
Firstly, being a good Jew, I want to respond to a question with a question. Since when? That's the only answer to the question here we were dealing, right? A Jew is someone who answers a question with a question. Well, since when was any depiction of society not political? Right. It's all politics. Everything I've said is politics, not in the sense maybe we're talking about in Israel, or you left or right wing, but in the sense that the domestic ideology preserved the rule of men, of a liberal democratic society based on male privilege, right up to the second half of the 19th century. In fact, women were not emancipated in England right till the beginning of the 20th century, and perhaps not fully emancipated till after the Second World War. And I think Noah has looked at the parallel between the struggle for Jewish emancipation in Germany with that for female emancipation. It is connected, and so everything is political also in England, and these missionary narratives were penned by women who were pushing a very political, social message about the place of woman in the home, not in the public sphere, which was the sphere of men. But that's where women saw they had power, in the home. So many women were writing in support of the domestic ideology, saying that when James or Charles goes off to fight for the British Empire in Douglas Africa, and they're in the jungle. He will remember that Mary is at home sitting at the hearth, looking after the home, and that is, of course, her secret power. These are very well-known narratives, and I think that the examples we have today are very much part of that political scene. Of course, Eitan is talking about a different angle of looking at really the same story. I didn't want to really get into Christian Zionism, but of course that's part of it, and it's a very mixed story. I mean, as some point out, we have lunatics who want to get on the white donkey and take the Jews back to the land. It depends on others who are not really concerned about Jewish welfare at all, but want to see the restoration of Zion as part of their own millenarian religious vision that has, of course, also to do with a political vision of England itself. And you see that also in Disraeli's novels, that political, very conservative vision of England's imperialist project. About readership and reviewers, like Scott reading Harrington, most readers, I think, were hoping that the Jewess would be converted or not turn out to be a Jewess after all, and they were rewarded with that expectation. So, like a lot of novelists, I think Edgeworth and Scott himself are playing with readers' expectations, pushing eroticism and exoticism of the other as far as politically is acceptable. I haven't really researched all the reviews, but that I think would be another book. Eitan, do you want to say something?
I'll just add in this context that very often the responses of readers were actually reflected in some authors' attempts to rewrite these novels. So Thackeray rewrites Ivanhoe in a way that would, conclude the pair that he wishes, and Daniel Deronda was also rewritten in a way. So very often the conclusion is not accepted by the writers, then it needs to sort of reimagine it. So that's one thing. I just have one final point. I mean, listening to you, because Efraim ends the book with a very impressive survey of contemporary popular culture, such as the League of Justice and Gal Gadot and Tarantino and so forth. And I actually, listening to you, I just had one addition to add to this, and this is interesting because in a way it brings the father back in, and this has to do specifically with British culture. And this is Amy Winehouse as the Jewish daughter, because in the recent documentary about her life, the Jewish father, emerges as the greedy Shylock Fagin type who cares nothing about his daughter's health and insists on screen. And I think that's interesting to see how, again, the father-daughter relationship here sort of returns in the image of this extremely sort of powerful contemporary image of the Jewess, who does not convert but simply dies at the end. So that's also interesting.
Yeah, so it's interesting how have this latent life, and when we're talking about popular culture, we're often talking about blogging and that kind of discourse, and that's very true, of course, of the Ivanka discourse, which came out before the elections and came out very strongly that everyone was sure should be the next Esther, and of course in real life, of course, by the way, her name is really Yael, you should know, not Esther. It doesn't come out very much at all, even her very feeble attempt to speak for women, and of course that's also true of Gal Gadot. It mattered to a lot of people when the film was still in production that Gal Gadot was in a combat unit in the IDF. That was so important. And who cares whether Wonder Woman was Jewish, Israeli, whatever? It matters to a lot of people. The film was banned for that reason in Lebanon and other Muslim countries. So these narratives have a strength that goes beyond even official discourse or reality. There is something in these responses that comes up with the same stereotypes, even among Jews who are very good at internalizing stereotypes, especially in America, where you have the anti-type of the strong Jewess and strong Israeli woman in the Jewish mother who smothers poor Alex Portnoy, who of course runs off to the Shiksa, and in my next book I'll have a chapter on the Shiksa, and particularly the German woman, the daughter of Germany, as another kind of mythical figure who has a very strong element in the Jewish imaginary. Yes, so these narratives are never linear. They circulate, they recycle, they get adapted. Thackeray, for example, rewrote Ivanhoe because he thought the Rowena was just so boring. I don't think he loved Jews, but he rather was attracted to the romantic idea of running off with a Jewess. Anyone but that awfully boring Rowena.
If possible, just to try to give my answer to Jaime's first question is taking one of the dialogue of Walter Scott Ivanhoe, if I remember well, whereas Rebecca is criticized, I think, by Ivanhoe himself, saying that look, the Jews are cowards. They cannot enter into a battle and fight like other men. And then the response of Rebecca is, but during the Bible, we used to be very heroic and powerful, and this is a lot, maybe has a lot to do with the relationship between the revival of Zion, Balfour Declaration, etc., and this biblical millenaristic idea according to which when Jews, they will restore to the land of Zion, they will convert to Christianity, but they also will be restored as full heroic men. And perhaps this has something to do with both dimensions.
Yes, indeed, but that's also because Scott is very critical of the new medievalism, this glorification of the Templars, which was very strong in France, by the way, at the time of Louis Philippe. There's the Templars Hall in Versailles, which is dedicated to the history of the Templars and this whole myth of the Templars. And Scott is very critical of that. And that's one reason why he has Rebecca retort, well, we have Jewish masculine strong heroes in our tradition, but the point is that since the fall of Jerusalem, the Jews have been in disgrace and they've lost their sovereignty. That's the point there. And of course nowadays Jewish authors write back to Ivanhoe too, and Rebecca gets to the land of Israel in one version that was published a couple of years ago, and Brian comes to court her and say, okay, it's all right, I don't care if you're Jewish.
I'm very proud of
but what happens in the postmodern version? She marries a Jew, and that's of course a Jewish writing back to Ivanhoe.
Well, I think I will represent everyone. Thank you very much for this presentation, and to Eitan for introducing you. Toda rabah.